here talking about his book. To introduce our speaker tonight is my colleague, Representative Barbara Ballard, who is the Associate Director at the Dole Institute for Civic Outreach by day, and then by night or by spring, she's a state legislator from here in Lawrence, and she's one of my heroes as well. To introduce tonight's speaker, Representative Ballard.
Say good evening, and I'm glad that you are all here this evening. Many of you know Roderick Bremby, and I said I was going to do that for him, and after that it's Rod. And you will all know him from being our assistant city manager. And I think many of you know him from being on the faculty as well. I'll tell you a few things about him that perhaps you do not know, and then we will get into why he made the decision that sort of rocked the state of Kansas. He was born in Eufaula, Alabama. In second grade, Rod and a classmate became the first black students to integrate into the public school system in Eufaula. It would be one of the 13 schools that Bremby, who was an Army brat, would attend before college. In 1972, as a pitcher and shortstop, Rod played in a Little League All-Star team in Holland and made it to the European Little World Series in Spain. The winner of the tournament, which was in Madrid, went on to play in the Little League World Series in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. In 1978, he was the senior class president, a member of the junior ROTC, and a baseball player. Bremby graduated from Leavenworth Senior High School. In 1982, Rod received a bachelor's degree in communications studies and psychology at the University of Kansas. In 1983, he interned in the public administration in Fort Worth, Texas. In 1984, he earned a master's degree in public administration at the University of Kansas to take advantage of a federally funded program that encouraged more minority and low-income students to get involved in community development. In 1990, he became the first black assistant city manager in Kansas. He also took the role as a number 2 man in the city of Lawrence. In the next 10 years, he would work on police and firefighting negotiations, help launch the Lawrence Partnership for Children and Youth, and act as a voice for the city during the 1993 floods. 2003, he was chosen by Governor Kathleen Sebelius to become the Secretary of Kansas Department of Health and Environment. The department has an annual budget of more than $200 million and regulates everything from daycare to oil spills. As the Secretary of Kansas Health and Environment, Rod makes national headlines when he denies permits for 2 coal-fired power plants in southwestern Kansas. The denial is based on concerns over carbon emissions. That decision places him squarely in the center of one of the state's most controversial debates. I can tell you, as Secretary of Health and Environment, he watches out for the whole state. I can also tell you that the decision he made was not made lightly. He has made the statement that he's a bureaucrat and he follows the laws. And where there's an absence of law, he has to use the best judgment he can with the help of his staff and others to make a law. And we have heard from the legislature about what decision, and does the Secretary of Environment have that much authority that he can make that decision? It's a tough decision, and some people might have gone the other way. But if you are doing your job around health and environment, and you have agreed to be the secretary, you have that responsibility to make the best choice possible for the good of the whole state. I invited some people to come when we were doing a Rotary Forum on Saturday morning. And I said, if you want to hear it straight from the horse's mouth, come to the Dole Institute on March 5th. And you will have that opportunity to ask him why he made the decision he did. But right now I want you to welcome him and acknowledge the person that had the courage to make that decision, knowing that there would be so many people opposed, and he has to work in Topeka, in the capital, and there's lots of other things that that department does besides dealing with coal-fired plants. Might I introduce to you and present to you to others the Secretary of the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, Rod Bremby.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out on such a cool night. Representative Ballard, I really need to take you everywhere I go for those introductions. Some of it reminded me of the article that was in the Lawrence Journal World several weeks ago, and some of those things I'd forgotten, and I think I was really pleased to see that most people, in fact my mom, had good things to say about me. Before I get started tonight, what I want to do is acknowledge just a couple of people in the audience. We are a very large agency at KDHE, fairly large agency at KDHE, but the agency is more than the secretary. In fact, we had a very good director of Environment Division, Ron Hammerschmidt, who went on to the EPA. But stepping in for Ron is John Mitchell. John Mitchell is our acting director of the Division of Environment. And so our bench is very deep. John just didn't come to the agency. He's been there for 30 years. And so we're really well positioned to carry on. One other person is Susan Kang. Susan Kang is a policy director at KDHE who helps to make sure that we are focusing on the right policy issues and make sure that people get to the right places to talk about the right things for the agency and for KDHE. Tonight is going to be an awkward night for me in a way because I really cannot disclose as much or talk about as much as I probably would like to. So as I mentioned to Dylan, and I don't know if Dylan is here, but he was from the UDK, called yesterday, I said it's going to be a tightrope, and we'll try to walk it as well as we can. But let me start by offering greetings, not only from our governor, but also from the 1,000+ men and women who make up the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. They are a fantastic group of people. I'm honored to work with them. I can't think of another place where I'd like to work or people that I'd like to work with. This has been a very trying time for them as well, and so I just want to acknowledge the work that they do. Our mission at KDHE is to promote the health and environment of all Kansans by promoting responsible choices. That's a little different mission than we've had in the past because we know that on the one hand we are a regulatory agency, but we believe that on the other hand the best way to do that is by educating, by providing technical assistance, by helping people comply with the rules and regulations that are adopted and are made by policymakers. And so we try to help that convergence happen around compliance. And so we want people to be able to make responsible choices for themselves and their communities. We think that by doing so, we can achieve our vision of healthier Kansans living in safe and sustainable environments. That's why I get up every day, is hopefully the work that we do collectively will result in healthier Kansans living in safe and sustainable environments. I'm sharing this with you hopefully to frame this decision process that we went through. And you will see hopefully that it's not far from where we ended up. Tonight there are three areas I want to focus on. First and foremost, giving deference to my academic background. I want to talk a little bit about a frame from public administration, a policy administration dichotomy. I think it will help also to share and explain why it is that we are where we are today. I think it will also explain some of the tension, some of the frustration, and even some of the anger that exists around the decision. But I do need to spend some time on this concept, this theory, because truly it is something that I was trained well on, and I firmly believe. Secondly, I want to talk about, and you might think of some of these as whimsical, but I want to clear the air on some items. And in our office today, we chose about 11, 12 items, and we said, it would be nice to clear the air on these items or these things. And so we'll do that for a little while. And then lastly, I want to wrap up by talking about an emerging economy. I want to leave tonight, and hopefully leave you, with some hope that out of all of this that we're currently going through, Kansas will be in a much better place. I was asked at dinner, I'll paraphrase, so if the decision should go the other way, from the way that you issued, how we feel about that. And again, my response is that, the policymakers will have spoken. And as a bureaucrat, I can help to bring alliance. I can help to bring implementation to that policy position. But I don't want to get ahead of myself, and at the end of the day, I think there's a lot more to be said about where we are. Let me start again by talking a little bit about the policy administration dichotomy, and if some of you are PAs in here and I'm just doing this rudimentary stuff, just tune it out for a while. I'm not going to stay on it very long. But Woodrow Wilson was probably one of our most intellectual presidents. He not only served as governor of New Jersey before coming to the White House, but he spent a lot of time in academia, created some very interesting structures, and thought a lot about how policy, how administration, how government, how the process of governance could even function. More specifically, he was thinking about the federal government, but we apply that to local government and state government in the context of a policy administration dichotomy. Let's say, for example, one of these circles, and it really doesn't matter which, would represent the policy sphere. That is the group of elected officials, the people who are chosen by the electorate to make decisions for them. They're the ones who express the values of a community, of a state, and of a nation. And so they have a legitimate right to make decisions. Oftentimes they vote to express those decisions. And then the other circle that you didn't choose would be the administration or the administrators. They're the ones who are chosen to implement those policies. Now, why was this important? Well, around the turn of the century, before we had reform, governmental reform, oftentimes appointed officials, the administrators, were hired by policymakers, and yet the administrator would do the work of the policymaker, regardless of what the values were within the society. They were hired hands. Some people call them hacks. They were political tools. Wilson thought that the administrator should be relatively independent, but only within a sphere of implementing policy. Now, if you'll notice closely, in all reality, sometimes those circles converge. Sometimes administrators veer into the policy arena, and sometimes policymakers veer into the administrative arena. Now, what I'm going to talk about later tonight is exactly that convergence that occurred this past year in Kansas around a permit decision for the emissions of a coal-fired plant. It is in that convergence then that there is a rethinking about roles, responsibilities, rights, rules, rule of law even, and the appropriateness of one group taking an action that is in the domain of the other, depending on your perspective. Now, I'm going to stop there on the theoretical stuff and talk more about the reality of what happened. But I want you to try to keep in mind that frame around the policy administration dichotomy and know that at times there is an overlap. And at times those overlaps have to be sorted out. New rules have to be developed so that everyone is comfortable with the role that each other will play. This afternoon, some of my staff members and I sat down and we started thinking about, so what could be useful this evening? What could you say to add some depth or some greater awareness about what has happened? And we came up with about 10 or 11 things that we've heard, and we thought this would be a good opportunity to, and pardon the pun, clear the air. And so I'm going to walk through some of these, and hopefully at the end we'll share some information if you believe that. Conversely, I think there's a question and answer session or period, and we'd be happy to address those. Now, let me start with the first one. Increases dependence on foreign powers. Some of you may have seen this ad, others may not. This was an ad run in most of the major Kansas newspapers, in fact, Kansas City, Missouri as well. This ad was run to suggest that because of the recent decision by the Semelius administration, Kansas will import more natural gas from countries like Russia, Venezuela, and Iran. Now, in terms of trying to clear the air, there would be no additional dependence on these foreign powers or foreign powers like these, because the U.S. imports some 96% of our natural gas from Canada. We have never, as a nation, nor as a state, imported any natural gas from any of these countries. So, in trying to clear the air, there is no increased dependence upon foreign powers for natural gas. There is a conversation about increasing dependence on oil, but that does not have a root in this decision about coal-fired plants. The next one is transmission lines won't get built. There was a conversation about transmission lines to move energy to a different plane, as well as to make way for renewable energy from wind to get to different markets. There was the assertion that if this denial was supported, that these transmission lines wouldn't get built. What I'm trying to show, and it may not be very clear, but it's an article from 2008. It reads, ITC Great Plains expansion in Kansas approved. What ITC is a company that builds transmission lines. They agreed and have said that they are going to go forward with this critical infrastructure regardless of whether the permitting decision stands or is overturned. So transmission lines will get built. Need for Western Kansas baseload energy. The permit decision was about a 1,400 megawatt facility. Initially, it was a 2,100 megawatt facility, 3 700 megawatt plants. Based on what we've read, there are 1,400 megawatts, how that would be allocated in the state. Roughly 15% of the energy, 210 to 225 megawatts, would remain in the state of Kansas. Oklahoma, through, I think it's Golden Spread, would receive about 400 megawatts of energy. And Colorado, through Tri-State, would receive 700 megawatts, or pretty much all of the energy from one of the plants. These numbers don't exactly total to 1,400, but this is what we have available to us. So the project allocation around resources and baseload energy for Western Kansas, if that is taken, is somewhere between 210, 225 megawatts. Okay, so you're left with 1,400 megawatt permit for baseload energy in Kansas of some 210, 225 megawatts. Croson. There's a gentleman who is a beautiful editorial cartoonist out of Wichita, and this is how he captures this arrangement. He says that, and this was from 4/5 or April 5th, 2007, long before we got to this place, is that other states get the energy and Kansas gets the shaft. That is how it's been characterized. But moving on to high electrical costs. There's been also discussion about this facility is needed to reduce or maintain some marketability around what energy costs are thought to be some 40% higher than the rest of the state. And so it helps to equalize the cost of electrical power out west. This is a map showing energy costs, and unfortunately it's not very clear, but the lime green is somewhere between $691 and $791 per kilowatt hour. The darker green is $792 to $903. By the way, the national average is something around $8 per kilowatt hour. What's in red is up to $10.39 per kilowatt hours. So the red is generally in the central part of the state and the southeast part of the state. So the energy for this facility would be on the western side of the state, where energy prices are not quite as great as the red and the orange. But that's one of the things that we heard. How many of you have heard this one? Lawrence, Kansas has the 7th dirtiest coal plant in the U.S. Okay. I often wondered why that was not discussed in greater detail. But this is a chart showing the annual CO2 emissions for every plant in the state of Kansas. The one beneath the red arrow is the Lawrence plant. If you look to the far side, 1,600 or 16 million tons, that's Jeffries Energy Center up in Topeka. Right next to it would be the sunflower proposed as well as the existing sunflower. Now, you can get to Lawrence being more of an emitter than the sunflower facility if you work averages, if you look at CO2 per kilowatt hour of operation. But when you're looking at gross totals, that's what we see. In fact, the Lawrence facility is a little over 4 million, about 4.5 million tons per year, annual. And that puts you right at about, I think it's 282 nationally. If you look over at the far left, Jeffries is about 16th nationally, and the sunflower facility would be right around 32, 33, somewhere behind a facility in Alabama. But again, Lawrence being the dirtiest plant in the nation, 7th dirtiest, you can't get there from here looking at gross numbers. You can get there from here if you do some, I think it's interpolation rather than extrapolation. We've also heard, if not here, then Holly, Colorado, Oklahoma, Iowa, and possibly even Missouri would be a home for these new facilities. But there's something going on nationally, and I'll get to that in just a little bit. But more than 20 plants were canceled, and 36 were delayed. And this graphic doesn't even begin to tell the question about those that were denied. Oklahoma denied a plant in 2007. Iowa denied one, although they have a couple others under permit. You may recall the article from last week in Missouri. That plant was approved, but the owners of the facility decided to delay Actually, they decided to cancel the plans to build that facility. So it's not just Kansas, but the likelihood that a denied facility could go anywhere is quite remote. We also heard that carbon is necessary for life, and it is. Climate change is good, and it can be. But in the context of what we were looking at in terms of the 11 million tons annual emissions, we've got some equivalents. Too much of anything is bad. That's just a truism. But in terms of carbon, we need a certain amount to live. No question about it. But too much can spoil the habitat in which we live. The equivalent would be 1.8 million passenger cars a year on the streets and roads and byways and highways of Kansas. Or 255 million seedlings grown for 10 years. They could then process the CO2. In fact, trees, forests are really a good thing because they can help cleanse the air. At the last place I showed this slide, I asked how many people have gas-powered, propane-powered barbecue grills, and quite a few hands went up. But the equivalent of about 415 million of those is what would be emitted every year at this facility. We could then divert waste from landfills as an equivalent to what this plant would release each year. It's about 3.5 million tons, or the carbon footprint of about 628,000 Americans. We all have a footprint, some larger than others. 20 tons is about average, but too much is not a good thing. Global warming is a hoax. I think many of you have heard that. And before I go any further, I want to make this crystal clear. I'm not a climatologist. I am not a meteorologist. This is not my field of study. All I know is what I've read. And so I'm just sharing with you. I'm not trying to argue this point with you. There are better people to argue the point with you. In fact, there's one here at the University of Kansas who actually served on the International Panel of Climate Change, Dr. Fedema. And then there's a professor who was also, or soil, I don't even know the term for what he does because it's so specialized, but he's at K-State, Chuck Rice, who is also on the IPCC. So if you want to get into a discussion, and I mean a vigorous discussion about climate change and the scientific components, I'd invite you to visit my friends, okay? And I hope I didn't put them on point. But we've been keeping records. Records have been kept since about 1860 about the surface temperatures of the globe. And what we know is that on average they've been rising. Initially, what people were saying is that, okay, so we should really talk about greenhouse gases. And that term went nowhere. In fact, most people thought, well, what's the problem with greenhouse gases? I've got a greenhouse. All the greenhouses I've been in are nice places to visit. Well, it obscured the fact that we have layered over the earth a blanket of gases, and now the temperature is rising, and it has effects on the earth, in our habitat. The 11 of the warmest years on record have occurred since 1990, and the 5 warmest of all have occurred in the last 7 years in descending order: 2002, 1998, 2003, 2001, 1997. And then the pace at which average global temperatures have been rising are about 0.6 degrees Celsius over the past century, accelerated in the last 2 decades to an equivalent of 1 degree Celsius per century. I don't know if the chart is very clear, but on the far right of the right chart, the past 1,000 years in the Northern Hemisphere, you can see a very acute rise. Now, as I said before, don't take my word for climate change, because I have not written a single study. I've not done the work. But if you don't want to take my word for it, which I'm urging you not to, and you don't want to take the word of the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, U.S. National Academy of Science, as a group, have the same belief that it's not a hoax. The Geological Society of America has come to the same position, that it's not a hoax. The American Geophysical Union, they too have come to the same conclusion, that it's not a hoax. The American Institute of Physics come to the same conclusion, that it's not a hoax. And the American Meteorological Society, they too, as a society of scientists, as a body of scientists, have come to the same conclusion that there's something to this climate change issue. One of the things that we've heard, and I will backtrack on some of this a little bit later, is that this violates the rule of law. What happened in Topeka in October violated the rule of law. In April of last year, the U.S. Supreme Court rendered what we believe to have been a significant finding. Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts, enjoined with other states from around the country, sued the U.S. Department of, the Environmental Protection Agency, about whether standards could be created for gas emissions, CO2 emissions from tailpipes of cars, of all things. The EPA argued a couple of different tacks, but largely the Supreme Court ruled that, carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases, they are a pollutant. When that relationship was made in terms of a pollutant, that then rang bells, I think, across the country in terms of what then do you do in a state where you have the responsibility to address pollutants. The U.S. Supreme Court, and this is just one of the paragraphs, said, in short, EPA has offered no reasoned explanation for its refusal to decide whether greenhouse gases cause or contribute to climate change. Its action was therefore arbitrary, capricious, or otherwise not in accordance with law, being U.S. law. The Supreme Court is saying that the EPA did not follow U.S. law, or it has an opportunity to speak again about why greenhouse gases are not pollutants. There's been no such movement by the EPA. There probably will not be any movement by the EPA, at least until January of 2009. Threat to the rule of law. As a bureaucrat, it's really not enough to begin to think about how federal law impacts your agency or your environment. You really have to go to state law. And so there was a request to the the Kansas Attorney General to say, okay, what are our options here? Do we have the ability then to process this permit with respect to what this new information allows, and more importantly, what Kansas law allows? In the letter, and I invite you to go out to our webpage, KDHE's webpage, to pull down that statement from the Attorney General. We asked whether we could deny, modify, or approve a permit, and also to delay a decision. Many of you know all too well that we bureaucrats tend to lean on delay. But delay is a good option sometimes because it creates an opportunity for that space to be filled, for new information to be discussed, for relationships to be worked out, for us to understand the limits as well as the values of the people that we represent. Of those options that were requested, the one that was taken off the table was delay. The opinion said that the statute does not afford you the opportunity to delay. So you're back to approve, modify, or reject. Notwithstanding any other provision of this Act, the Secretary may take such actions as may be necessary to protect the health of Kansans or persons or the environment upon receipt of information that the emission of air pollution presents a substantial endangerment to the health of persons or to the environment. That is based on, KSA 65-3012. There was also KSA 65-3005 that also allowed us to take action in terms of denying the permit. Now, what I communicated was not that I believe climate change exists. That's really doesn't matter as a bureaucrat. What I said is that it would be irresponsible to ignore emerging information about the contribution of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases to climate change and the potential harm to our environment and health if we do nothing. I mentioned at the table earlier before we came out that this was not a 2-year, a 5-year, a 10-year decision. This is a 40, 50-year decision. Once these facilities are built, they're around for a while. So it wasn't an easy place to get to. November 28th, the Kansas Supreme Court, acting because there were appeals filed. In fact, there were appeals filed in county court, and there was an administrative appeal filed to review or reconsider the decision. The administrative hearing route is written into Kansas law, rules and regulations, that if a decision is thought to be wrong, onerous, incomplete, you appeal. There's also Kansas law that provides or affords one the opportunity to appeal in district court. The Supreme Court thought it was such a significant issue that it pulled all of those appeals in district court unto itself some 6 weeks after the decision. Very, very speedy. The administrative hearing process was put on hold pending a decision from the Supreme Court. That is the rule of law as we understand it. Lastly, we've heard that one of the things that I've been questioned about often is that so what do you do with facilities that currently exist? Say the Westar facility out here north of town, or the Jeffries facility over in Topeka. What do you do with them? And since they already have a permit, I've often said we need to sit down and talk with them because we need to try to achieve some voluntary reductions in CO2 emissions. Several weeks ago, I was in front of a committee and I was asked, well, what stick do you have? And, didn't really think it needed a stick, but we responded that we think that we can have conversations and get to a place where reductions can occur voluntarily. Well, this article comes from February 28th and it reads just in part that lawmakers worry about the existing coal-fired plants, and they were concerned that I might try to force these utilities to either shut down, which, you know, I think there was a comment about the night the lights went out in Lawrence, but anyway, John's staff, same staff, air radiation staff, worked very diligently with Westar, and last Friday, they signed an agreement to voluntarily reduce their carbon dioxide emissions without a stick, without inducements, without twisting of arms, So we think this is the path that we need to be on as a state until there is a process to get to rules and regulations around CO2 reductions, what the levels will be. The stick, and I responded to one of the senators in the meeting, that the stick that I'm worried about is the federal stick. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Now, what does this agreement do? Did we write in any reductions? No. A modified permit would have written in some arbitrary reductions. What we asked the facility to do, the company to do, was analyze all of their facilities, come back to us, and give us your assessment of what you can do to reduce your CO2 emissions. Further, we want you to report your emissions to a climate registry. And we want you to be willing to make some adjustments to your facility, your plants, if you can do so. One of the concerns was, well, what if we can't get reimbursed for those changes to our facilities? Well, as people do when they sit and talk, they said, well, it sounds just like you need an off-ramp. We don't want to force something that you really can't afford or pay for. So if that's not possible, if you can't get reimbursed, you've got an off-ramp. We'll put that on hold. But anything below $1 million that you believe you can do, we need you to do that. Anyway, you'll be hearing more, if you haven't already, about this Westar agreement and how this fits into the discussion, but a stick is not necessary. Lastly, I want to talk in this setting, in terms of clearing the air, about regulatory uncertainty. That's a nice phrase. It's artfully crafted. But in our way of thinking, there is no regulatory uncertainty. We've issued 171 air quality construction and operating permits since the October 18th denial. Timely issuance. And since 2003, January 2003, we've issued almost 2,900 air quality permits. Over that same time frame, the only denial was the sunflower permit. There's nothing uncertain about that. The only thing I can talk about now is what is already a part of the record, and so I'm going to share some things with you. You may not be able to see this chart very well. I'll try to walk you through it if I can. Along the x-axis, the bottom, is 255 of the largest CO2 permits issued by the state since January of 2003. Now, the reason why there's 255 is because Excel will only allow 255. But if we had another 2,700 spaces, they would be smaller than the ones you see here. The very far right, at the very top, 11 million tons of CO2, that's the Holcomb permit. The one you see next, about the middle, is Sand Sage, about 4.7 million. That was never built. And the next one down from that is an Emporia peaking plant, if operated at full capacity. It's a little under 3 million tons annually. The absolute scale is significant. Put it in another context. There's a group of folks in the Northeast. In fact, the states in the Northeast have created this group called we call them RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. They, as a group of states, are working together, looking at climate action plans and policies to try to reduce overall emissions for this region. The region includes New York, includes Massachusetts, it includes Rhode Island. It includes the big states in the northeast part of the United States. Their goal for CO2 reduction as a part of their concern for climate change by the year 2020, so working concertedly together until the year 2020, they thought their goal, an appropriate goal for them, would be a 12 million ton a year reduction. That RGGI collaborative affects some 45 million Americans. This one facility would have just about wiped out, eliminated, erased any of their efforts through the year 2020. There's been conversation about, well, why is the state moving on this now? Why don't we wait for the federal government? This is it's a global issue. But at the very least, shouldn't we wait for the federal government to act? In terms of environmental action, states have always preceded the federal government. Acid rain laws, first state action in 1985. Federal acid rain program, 5 years later, 1990. State air toxic laws, 1987. Federal followed in 1990. Nitrous oxide, NOx trading, 95. Federal NOx State Improvement Plan, 2004. State mercury rules, which are also up for reconsideration, followed states by some 7 years. Statewide greenhouse gas reductions, some were introduced as early as 2003. Federal laws have been introduced. Again, regulatory uncertainty. The stick that I mentioned that I'm most fearful of in Washington is one that may position states to deal with greenhouse gases in ways that we are not yet prepared. Most of the legislation in the 110 Congress, there's a lot of components, but one of the most significant components is reducing emission reduction by 60 to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Well, where'd they come up with that? Well, the IPCC has projected how much carbon dioxide, in our atmosphere is possible without irreversible harm. Call it stabilization. 450 million parts, 450 parts per million, is where that stabilization level is. In order to get there, this is the glide path. 80% reduction from your 1990 emissions levels by the year 2050. These are other federal bills that have been introduced. There's the Feinstein-Capper, there's the Kerry-Snow, there's the McCain-Lieberman bill, there's the Sanders-Boxer bill, Lieberman-Warner. There are a lot of bills in Congress under consideration for addressing climate change. This is a comparison of what those bills will do in order to try to achieve that equilibrium. The line that you see trending up is business as usual. If we do nothing, that's what we're talking about. Warner Lieberman is probably the bill that has most conversation. All it's talking about is a system that caps U.S. emissions, puts a limit on all CO2 emissions in the United States. So once we have our bucket and we're assigned or allocated an amount of emissions, anything above that could result in fines, fees, reduction of federal resources. They will also restricted transportation dollars in the past. Or you can also auction off these allocations. Most of the RGGI states have decided to auction those off because they believe that will send a true price signal for carbon. Our best guess is that the price of carbon per ton will be somewhere between $20 to $30 per ton to emit. This facility going forward, 11 million tons at $20 per ton, is $220 million for the right to operate. Who pays that cost? There are a lot of other things that we've heard that we'd love to try to clear the air about. But again, I'm just trying to share with you some of the things that helps to give you a flavor of where we are and where we're going. This next segment is not quite as long as the last, but it's talking about a new economy. It's where will we be after all of this is said and done? Whether the decision is overridden, whether there's a veto, whether there's a veto override, it really doesn't matter in the context of this new economy that I'm going to be talking about. We think of the U.S. grain market as a huge market. In fact, we have Midwest economies that spend a lot of effort trying to be a part of that marketplace. But the carbon marketplace is already bigger than the U.S. grain economy through trading. It's forecasted that this market will be in the $1 trillion range annually. And that's just the U.S. carbon market. This is approximately 2.5 times the European carbon market. We're talking about a different environment. We're talking about a different economic environment that, unfortunately, we're not ready to play in. This cap and trade, what I was talking about in terms of capping the emissions and either trading the allocations or auctioning the allocations, this $1 trillion figure is based upon that process continuing. Warner Lieberman is probably the bill to keep your eye on. That's the one that has the most legs. But before I go forward, cap and trade, Warner Lieberman, it's not sufficient to get us to where we need to be in terms of addressing climate change. So don't let anyone tell you that, okay, if we do Warner Lieberman, we're done and we can go home. All we got to do is cap the emissions of these big plants and we're okay. You, me, we all are going to have to look at our footprint. We're going to have to look at how it is that we reduce the use of energy. I'm going to put on my public health hat for just a second. Bear with me. One of the issues that we're concerned about as a nation is energy balance. Energy in, energy out. We call that food, and we call it physical activity. In much the same way, we've got to come into balance with the energy that we use to drive our economy, to get our entertainment, to get our education. This is a whole different world, folks. This is a whole different world. The EU has already decided it's going to be a player. No, I take that back. They're not going to be a player. They're going to lead. They want to lead the world in this post-industrial revolution. And that's a low-carbon environment, economy. They say they need new policies to face this new reality. Germany has decided no more coal plants. The whole EU has begun to invest in a super grid. That's what's known as a super grid. Because they know that nuclear, France is very well positioned nuclear. But coal, gas, they think that they can get sufficient energy out of wind. And so these transmission lines are established in a super grid because they think that, well, wind is intermittent. Some places it's not going to blow. How do you get energy to the places where you need it? The grid covers the entire continent of Europe, conceptually. So when the wind isn't blowing in Denmark, maybe it is in Portugal. But they'll move the wind around. Less cost, stability, and a leader in this global marketplace. It's just one example of many. China. One of the things I heard, and it didn't make the top list, okay? But people say, well, you know, what are we going to do? China's building a coal-fired plant every week. Yeah, they are. But they're also spending about $10 billion a year on renewable energy technology, second only to Germany. They're doing the old century stuff, and they're positioning themselves to be the leader in this new economy. We can't allow them to distract us by the use of the old technology. We do. They could set the standards for equipment, for insulation, for motors. There's something I heard 2 weeks ago I want to share with you because it blew me away. Erie, Pennsylvania has the home of the largest train locomotive facility in the United States. GE is the company that owns the outfit. They export more trains to Mexico and China than anyone in the world. China makes their own trains. They're 30% less costly. But these trains from Erie, New York, not Pennsylvania, Erie, New York, have lower emissions, greater power, greater efficiency. That's the new economy that we're talking about. Up here, there's probably some of you in the room who were probably not around or not even born when some of us knew that man hadn't even touched this surface yet. In fact, some of us remember waiting up to see if we actually made it to the moon. But there was a president who decided that we needed to take that chance. In fact, he said by the end of the decade, we would have a man on the moon. And so he harnessed a nation to go out and do something that had never been done. A lot of risk. Could have fallen flat. But he says, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Went to Rice University some 8 months later to really explain why it was important to go to the moon. It's called the New Ocean speech. I would encourage you to go to the library. No, Google it. It's even better. Google it. Sorry if there are any librarians in the room. But read the New Ocean speech because it really talks about the need for exploration and why we went to the moon, at least in President Kennedy's eyes. For those of you in the back who can't read this, it says, we shall go to the moon and do the other things, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. We sail on this new sea because there's new knowledge to be gained, new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all people. That's part of the reason why we went to the moon. Not to just get there first. It's just dust and rocks. But we are actually on the verge of a similar exploration. It's probably the moonshot of our lifetime. We need to be successful. This is just one. Plan. This plan will be presented to the next president, incoming president. One point that I want to go back and hit. If you don't think that this carbon legislation is coming down the pike, I invite you to go to the policy planks of the 3 remaining frontrunners in the presidential campaign. Every single one of them are moving on carbon legislation. Not to mention Boxer, Senator Boxer, who has a committee who's already functioning. She also has her own bill. Warner and Lieberman bills out there. So it's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. Anyway, the Apollo Alliance talks about employment that could be derived from an investment in green technology. And it talks about energy efficiency, being able to create 21.5 jobs for every million invested. Renewable energy, creating more jobs than other sources of energy, 4 times as many jobs per megawatt of installed capacity as natural gas, and 40% more jobs than dollar invested in coal. These jobs will come not in the service industry, service sector, but in the manufacturing sector. Again, there's some in the room who probably never thought that we'd see growth in the manufacturing sector in this country again. But not only is it possible, it's doable, it's necessary in terms of this new green economy. What will this investment look like? What might it look like? How about $30 billion a year for 10 years? 3.5 million jobs, $1.4 trillion to the GDP. The $1.4 trillion is important to me also because $2 trillion is what we spend annually on health care. And I know that's about 15% of the GDP. So you're talking about increasing our GDP by 10, 12%. But most importantly, look at the very bottom figure, $284 billion in net energy cost savings. We can expand and yet save money. That's the new economy. Climate policy is something that we're all going to have to wrestle with. It's not in my domain. It is not in KDHE. It is not in agriculture. It is not in commerce. It is not in any single state agency. And that is some of what makes this issue so complex. It touches on all of us. It will impact all of us. It needs all of us to be engaged in the conversation. And at the end of the day, there will be a conversation. So, if you have been feeling somewhat concerned about what's happening in Topeka, you're a little amused, some are a little stunned by what's happening, don't let it take your eye away from what will ultimately happen, and that is Kansas will, at the end of the day, be positioned, as Kansas often is, a leader, nationally and globally. We can and we must do this. So hopefully I've given you enough to think about, and I think there's a moderated question and answer session. I hope I didn't dance too much, but
we do have questions, and we have students on either side, so raise your hand, please. Remember, just ask the question so we can get as many as possible.
Hi, you didn't talk about mercury emissions as part of your regulatory process. Is there some way that it could have been addressed, or was it addressed, or?
we did not talk about mercury in the context of CO2. Mercury is one of those regulated emissions in one of the things that we could share with you, and I don't know that it serves very much purpose, but the draft permit that we considered for the new facility would have driven mercury emissions down. Our staff did a very good job of holding the company to some very extreme levels, and the company was willing to do that. Now, in terms of mercury emissions in the current facility, 325 megawatt facility out in Holcomb, that's in the top 10, top 12 in the nation in terms of emissions. The company is going to do something about that. They are working on that. We are working with them on doing something about that. Mercury is nationally an issue because, again, the EPA has chosen not to put in place rules and regulations that are essential to removing as much mercury as is possible and technically possible out of our environment. We know the harm that mercury causes, and so we can do better. I happen to think in Kansas, with our technical staff, with the environmental division, we are doing better, and we will continue to do better.
Go ahead.
Rod, I'm sure you know that on a per capita basis, Kansas has been last among 50 states in having energy efficiency programs either sponsored by our utilities or government. But what we have going on in Topeka now is legislation to promote nuclear power, and they want Wolf Creek 2 pretty badly. Can you talk about what's the carbon footprint to build a nuclear power plant and the steel and concrete and that? And how long would it ever take to work through that footprint so it would actually do something for greenhouse gases?
Okay. I'll try to take as much of that as I can. The very first response that I can make is that I am delighted that that permitting process is not ours. That would be the EPA's. I don't know the life cycle cost footprint for carbon for a nuclear facility. And that's one of the things that we begin to take a look at is the life cycle costing of carbon. But in terms of the operating footprint of nuclear, is virtually nothing. That's one of the reasons why people are wanting to go towards nuclear energy. The point that you first made, which is significant, is that we have not, Kansans, me, all of us, have not done a very good job of being more efficient in the energy that we use. In fact, we can make enormous strides as a state. In fact, we can show the nation in terms of reduction of use by efficiency standards that we know other states are already doing. But what will it take? I think it takes a plan. We have companies who have communicated efficiency methods and techniques, but there really hasn't been, I think, an education about the need, the desire, why it's important. If I were to tell my 15-year-old that it's critical for our environment if you turn out the light every time you leave the room, he would probably get it. If we tell people that those are some of the choices we're going to have to make, they will get it. Kansans are responsive. They do what's right. So, first part of the question, nuclear, I don't know the footprint because, I don't know the life cycle costing. Efficiency is where we really need to point, personal. Yeah, it is coming more than likely, but if it comes, it'll come through EPA and it won't be KDHE.
Hi, I have two questions, and they're very different, and perhaps
Could I please ask you just limit to one because I see 8 different hands, okay? I'm sorry.
Then I'll ask the perhaps easier one.
Thank you.
And that, perhaps, and that is, what was the estimate of jobs, skilled and unskilled, that these two plants would provide to western Kansas? And are there any ideas for mitigating the sting to them of losing those potential jobs?
Absolutely. The job numbers are, let me go with the number that I know, okay? And that is, I think the operational footprint, employment footprint of the plant is about 140. Is that right, John? It's about 140 jobs. Since October, we have issued 2 permits for facilities, either biodiesel or ethanol, something like that, with jobs of 90, something like that for Western Kansas. More importantly, renewable energy has the opportunity for more job growth. And so whatever we can do to continue to talk wind, Western Kansas, to talk about green jobs, that's what we need to do. This is not, and I guess I could have put this on the list, it's not a east versus west thing. It's not a rural versus urban thing. This is fundamentally a Kansas thing. And we've got to find a way to make it work for everyone. So we're not advantaged because those jobs aren't there. No one is advantaged. But yes, we are looking. Commerce Department is looking. In fact, we're working with Commerce on a project to get some jobs out in Dodge City, I believe. There was a facility coming in out there, and so we're continuing to work to try to get jobs from Western Kansas.
Mark?
Earlier you highlighted RGGI as an initiative that 8 northeastern states are implementing, and I was just curious if you felt like this initiative would be pertinent to Kansas. Do we have plans to carry out something similar to RGGI?
Thank you. Good question. I mentioned RGGI because it was just right off the top, and it provided for a nice comparison. But Kansas has already signed up for a Midwest initiative. We're actively looking at setting goals together and working as a region to try to reduce our greenhouse gases. There's the Western States, Western Climate States Initiative, John. I keep leaning on John. Western Climate States. I'll stop. Okay, you don't have to listen anymore. But there are other initiatives. Only the southeast part of the United States is not involved in a regional approach. But yes, we are actively involved in a regional approach to try to reduce our greenhouse gases with our friends and neighbors.
Okay. Ryan, do you have one?
Lady right up here. No?
Okay. All right, we have one in the back. You're trying to follow what I'm doing. I'm trying to come up front, medium up front, back, and make sure people don't feel because they're in the back, we don't see them.
Rod, one of the marks of a good leader is the ability to explain things. Thanks for doing that tonight. We appreciate that. Your list of things that you are refuting suggests many of the tactics of opposition. Deny, discount, discredit, you know the list.
You trained me well on that, Steve.
Which of those forms of opposition was the hardest to counteract?
Discredit. What Stephen Fawcett is talking about is tactics that are often used in social behavior. And I invite you to go out to the community toolbox. They're listed out there. And we've studied them often. But discredit is probably the most difficult to deal with because of the position that we are in. We cannot talk about in civil discourse the other party without appearing to be somewhat defensive or offensive. But over the next several days, weeks, you'll be seeing more discrediting going on. And at the end of the day, the thing that we need to know is that Kansas will move through this. I didn't mention this, but I probably should. Since October, I've had the chance to go to quite a few places for business reasons. People are asking about Kansas and what's going on in Kansas. There is a national focus on what is happening here, unlike anything I've ever seen. And it's not critical of Kansas. It's just inquisitive of Kansas. And I think they're waiting to see how we resolve this. I think they're waiting to see how we will move on this. I have every confidence that Kansas will come out of this as a leader, that we will be a leader in this new green economy, regardless of what you've read, what you've seen, and the positions that have been taken. At the end of the day, I have faith that we will get this right. So, long response to a short question, Steve.
Questions? May I have the microphone over here, please?
I want to thank you very much for making a very good decision. I'm Eileen Smith, and you probably have gotten quite a few letters from me.
I have.
Well, the thing I think that is important if we're going to do this, if we're going to do something, I mean, we've been hearing renewable energy since 1970s. I've had my business since 1992. I've been all over the world giving talks and workshops. I'm just finishing my second book, A Convenient Truth, about solar energy. But the problem that I'm having is the lack of regulatory access to evolve renewable energy business. Our incentives are being given primarily, the federal incentives are being given to big oil cartels. And so I would be more than happy to be responsible to turn off the lights a little more often, but I think that we have to show a responsible red carpet, really, to renewable energies in the state.
I agree. At the risk of getting to where you were going, and if I put words in your mouth, I'm sorry, but
how do we do that?
How do we do that? I think it starts with a plan. It starts with a plan. Arizona has completed a climate change action plan some years ago. They just launched the largest solar energy facility development this nation has ever seen. They know what their resources will be for renewables. They're lining up for that. Nationally, we've got to get our policy picture in place so that the tax credits don't go to companies that, yield about $3.4 billion a quarter.
Yes, well, so the program that I'm proposing has no tax credits. It actually is a nonprofit project, and so you wouldn't need those incentives. What I'm asking for is just audience so that we can discuss the program.
Tell you what I will promise to do, and I'll follow back on your letters, and we will sit down and we'll try to figure out something. Okay?
Thank you very much, sir.
Do we have additional questions? Oh, we do. Right here, please. And we have these two. Oh, and you have one back there. All right. We'll take those four and probably we'll stop, okay?
Rod, you've talked in depth about the legal aspects of the problem, some about the scientific aspects of the problem. This is a public policy debate. You did allude to your own personal ethics. How do we as a state address the ethical dimensions of this problem?
That's got to be the hardest question. How do we address the ethical component of the problem? Since you're sitting here in Douglas County, it's an easy one. You don't have a problem with ethics here in Douglas County. At least your legislators don't. But I would urge you to maybe look at other. I'm hedging on this a bit because I don't want to get actively involved in this. This gets into the political side, and I probably shouldn't. So, Douglas County, you're well positioned. How the rest of the state handles the issue, I don't know.
We'll take this question, Mark, please, here. That's two right here. Okay. That's three if I'm counting correctly. Okay.
I just want to thank you for giving me hope that there are still true public servants in our government. It was amazing.
Thank you. Let me just say one thing about that before you ask your question, and that is there are hundreds within my agency alone up in Topeka. You all have some of the best public servants anywhere up there working day in, day out trying to serve Kansans. They exist. They're there. They don't have the opportunity to get out in front and talk to people, but trust me, they're there. They're there.
I just want to applaud you for telling big business that the Kansas sky is not for sale. And in my eyes, you're a hero. My question is, why will the Kansas Chamber of Commerce and its backers fight your decision so ferociously every step of the way?
That's a good question. I do know that I've not talked to them, or vice versa. But, you know, I think people make the best decision based upon the information that they have available. And some of the information that may be helpful has not been available to them. I don't know why they might do that, but I do know that the Kansas Chamber has a great opportunity, again, to harness this economy in a direction that can lead this nation. And I hope that they're open to it at the end of the day. I really hope that they will be.
I just want to say I support your decision. I'm actively working to try to educate and change some legislative minds. I do have a question. You showed a slide, the Excel spreadsheet up there about the permits,
yes,
and stressing that with rare exceptions that are small. One of the criticisms I've heard levied is, taken as a group, some of the permits you've offered, like all the ethanol plants, like there were 18 of them, in the aggregate would approximately equal the whole kind of thing. So how do we think about that? Because if that's true, and I'd be glad to be convinced otherwise, but I think it is, we've released that big component of gas into the atmosphere for a cause that I think not everybody agrees is particularly worthwhile either. So how do we sort things like that out?
It's an excellent question. I won't go into too much detail in terms of a response, but I will try to offer something up, and that is this decision on a permit was not meant to be a permanent decision-making process. First step, 11 million tons, let's stop that. Let's have a conversation about what we need to do. And thirdly, let's execute the plan. I don't think we're going to be in the same position 6 months, a year from now where, you know, another permit comes through and, you know, 11 million tons and we say no. But unfortunately, this, in terms of its scale, the one, and the April U.S. Supreme Court decision, they all lined up. Unfortunately, it was the right set of circumstances to address the right issue, and so we did it.
First, I want to say thank you, and
it's good to see you tonight.
I know how fast children grow up, but how are we? How does the Kansas Department of Health and Environment develop programs to educate the young so they can make decisions, a strong decision like you've made, and have the background to do it?
That's a great question. We have, with I think Ron's leadership, Ron Hammerschmidt's leadership, who's already gone to the EPA, Bill Biter, who works in solid waste, put together some contracts with some great third-party organizations to educate our youth about the environment. There is a quarterly, I said I wasn't going to do that. I think there's a quarterly newsletter that goes to every third grader in the state that talks about the environment. We have an annual calendar competition so that kids can create artwork around how to keep Kansas clean. We did one of the most extensive PR campaigns. It was we didn't hire a new firm or anything. We had our own staff use their creativity. Get caught recycling. I mean, you probably saw some of the ads. We got people like Wayne Simeon. We got people like what's that power cat up there to the? Anyway, Willie the Wildcat was on there. We have been trying to educate. We can do more, But I think what's most important is we really need to try to get this together as a group. I know that if I toss a plastic in the trash can, my 15-year-old is going to toss his too. But if I get up early one Saturday and drag the bag on out to Walmart's recycling facility here, they're going to want to go too. And so I think for me and for us, until we can get additional resources to put more out there, we're just going to have to do it. We're going to have to model it. We're going to have to be it. I think it was Gandhi who says, be the change you hope to see.
Before I turn it over to our interim director, Jonathan Earl, I just want to say, as part of the appropriations, I serve on the social services budget, and KDHE is part of the social services budget. And what I said earlier, we have so many different components to that committee. And I just want to, and I'm looking at the KDHE people here, they do an overall fine job. And you would have to look at it in terms of all the things they do to know that this decision could not have been made lightly. With that, I turn over to John.
Thank you. This will be very quick. I want, first of all, to thank the Honors Program, especially Stan Lombardo and Sarah Crawford Parker for being such wonderful partners and letting the Dole Institute work with Honors and the Commons in the University Lecture Series. And most of all, I want to thank Secretary Bremby for his time and his thoughtfulness. Thank you for coming tonight.